I guess people are getting some back there still, so I'll wait a second. I think to introduce what we're doing today, I should say a little bit of background about how it came about. Essentially, some conversations started happening in the hallway and elsewhere concerning the emergence of ChatGPT and other AI tools that have kind of sprung onto the scene. And Ankur and I decided basically that it might be kind of interesting to have not a seminar, because if this was a seminar, I would have not agreed to do this today because it would require preparation. But we had decided that we would try to get people together to have a conversation about the implications of ChatGPT and related tools for our field, both in education and research. That would be our main focus. So actually, Ankur is caught in a PhD defense, so he's not here yet. I wasn't expecting to lead off, but I'll introduce myself. I'm Grant Petty. Most of you, I think, or all of you probably know who I am. And so he was going to basically lead off with a few slides just to kind of prime the discussion. I was going to follow with some slides, which I will now lead off with, to prime the discussion. And then once we've gotten through that, then it's just basically going to be an open forum to discuss any observations or questions or anything that comes to your mind that relates to the specific topic. So that's really what's it about. I wasn't sure whether we would expect 3 people here or a whole room. We got a whole room of people. Looks like it's mostly students. It should be interesting, and we'll see how it goes. So as I sat down to think about how to kick off my part of it, I basically thought, well, let's pose it to ChatGPT. What would be a good title for this talk, or a title for this presentation? And this is what I got back. And you read all that, and it's really very kind of jargony academic stuff, which sounds very cliche in a way. So I didn't find any of these titles particularly compelling. So, but that's characteristic of the technology. It's basically learning common associations, common phrases, and so on that it then generates in response to a prompt to say things that sound plausible and sound quasi-human in a way. So I also asked ChatGPT to say what ChatGPT is. And this is what ChatGPT responded with. And this all strikes me as very relevant and correct. It's a large-scale natural language processing model developed by OpenAI. A lot of you have probably been hearing about this. It's been trained on massive amounts of data to generate human-like response to text-based processes. It's capable of a wide range of tasks, language tasks, but bleeding into all kinds of other tasks as well. And it mentions here language translation, summarization, question answering, but it actually is able to do things that go far beyond that. It's widely regarded as a significant breakthrough in the field of AI and natural language processing. And I think it correctly points out that it has the potential to transform various industries, including healthcare, education, finance. I would add a whole lot more. My daughter is a lawyer, and her boyfriend's a lawyer, and they looked at ChatGPT. They posed some sample questions and said, we're out of jobs. Lawyers may be out of jobs, or they may have to completely redefine their jobs in the future based on the ability of ChatGPT, even now in its current phase, to create very useful, encapsulated responses relating to legal tasks. So I also asked ChatGPT, what is not? And it was very quick to emphasize, to reassure me, I think, that it's not a sentient being capable of independent thought. It's not free from biases or limitations of the data it's trained on. It's not, I'm going to say yet, a replacement for human intelligence or creativity in all fields. It's not a perfect tool that always generates accurate and relevant responses. I'll have a fair amount to say about that particular point, because that's, I think, really important to keep in mind. And it's not a search engine, or that last one, by the way, is actually my addition to what ChatGPT says. It's not a search engine. It's not a knowledge database. It hasn't memorized a whole body of randomly disconnected facts. It's basically memorized probabilistic relationships between words and phrases. And that's the basis for what we perceive as knowledge and insight, okay? All right. It's just kind of a side thing. One of the things I did a couple of days ago that I thought would be kind of fun is, you've probably all heard of the psychologist, the psychoanalyst Carl Jung, who revolutionized psychoanalysis back in the day, and he has this word association thing that he did, and he has 100 standard words, and he basically says, give an instant response to this word, see what happens. So I took all 100 words and gave it to ChatGPT using this prompt right there, and it was eager to play. And these are the kind of responses we got. These are the words that were supplied by Carl Jung, these are the responses. And I don't have to go into these, but you basically can see that if this were a real human, it would be the most boring, least imaginative person ever. Because every word is like the most obvious possible association you can think of is what comes out. And again, because it's relying on probabilistic relationships to kind of govern what it does in response to a prompt. So I thought that was interesting. I was kind of hoping that there wouldn't be weird, kind of dark, sinister things coming out of words like, I don't know, I guess it's not a good example, but who knows? It could have been interesting to see if something had come out that was a little less expected, but it was as expected as you could get. So there's been a lot of people commenting in the media about ChatGPT and AI in general recently, and until a few days ago, I would have said that most recent commentators seem to fall into groups. There's basically those who see enormous potential in AI, and they're kind of hyping the capabilities. At the same time, they're kind of tending to discount or overlook its present-day limitations. And then there's the other group, and Noam Chomsky had a piece in the New York Times recently where basically, I think he's only able to see limitations and discounts and overlooks its enormous potential. Well, I recently revised a slide because there's a third group. And that's the people who think that hyper-intelligent AI could kill us all. I won't have much to say about that because I'm still trying to visualize exactly how that happens, but there's a significant number of very, very smart people that think that AI is going to be a serious problem for humanity. And what this brought to my mind is right when I came here I started here in August of 2000. It turns out that right in that month when I came here to Wisconsin, there was also an article in The Onion, which of course was a local homegrown thing at the time, right? And it had this article that came to my mind about dolphins evolving opposable thumbs, right? And I believe I speak for the entire human race. Okay, so, take dolphins out, put AI in there, and that's kind of my reaction, to this development. I know that's the reaction of a lot of other people as well. I had gone into it big time. I've basically done the deep dive. I'm using it every day for all kinds of things because I've discovered I can be lazy and still do things. But I'm also deeply concerned about, the various things that could happen. And I'm not the only one, and others are not, but this guy, I'm not an AI expert. I knew this guy's name. I had seen him in interviews talking about AI, and he just left Google specifically to be able to speak freely about how he thinks that this thing may get out of our control and basically make things very bad. And just for context, for those who don't know, he's the one who promoted the idea of neural networks back in the 90s before anybody believed they could actually work. And he was kind of an outlier, and now he's been vindicated in that neural networks have become the basis for an awful lot of artificial intelligence. And if somebody with that kind of credibility is concerned, then I'm concerned too. Anyway, but this is not going to be about that because I'm not sure we even have the means to understand what the risks are. What I do want to do is briefly come back to alerting you to the kinds of things that are already out there that relate to academics. And this is a paper I found on Arxiv, and it's actually like a 95-page paper. But a lot of that is examples of using ChatGPT or GPT 3.5, which is the engine behind ChatGPT, for academic writing. And so lots of examples of what kind of ways you can prompt for certain things. And I've actually taken excerpts out of there and put them on the slides. And I'm not going to discuss them in detail, but the idea is just to give you a sense of what academics like this individual here are already showing is possible with ChatGPT. And so there's 5 prompts for writing papers with ChatGPT, and so each slide will be one of those prompts. The first one is, Using it as a stylus. Use GPT as an effective writing tool by typing chunks of text without worrying too much about the style, grammar, and spelling, and then basically letting ChatGPT clean it up for you, make it flow, and make it more natural, get rid of errors, get the punctuation right, and all that. And there's an example here of the specific prompt you would give ChatGPT. Rewrite the following text in first person. I don't know what Rick is. Clear in an academic language, probably rich, I think. Insert the text, and then have it copy edit the following text. And so there's examples of where you can already do that right now, and it works quite well, actually. Research Buddy. It can be used for exchanging research ideas and starting points of academic writing. And I found that I can put general questions to ChatGPT, and it comes out with fairly nuanced, and I'm not going to say insightful because I'm not saying it right, but it is able to prompt me with ideas of angles that I hadn't necessarily thought of. And you can use that essentially to kind of prime the pump in terms of coming up with ideas you can pursue further in terms of certain applications. Bullet a paragraph, give it a paragraph, and have it generate bullet points to summarize it. One thing I've heard that people are already doing downstairs at SCCC is taking an app that records a conversation, like in a meeting, and captures it from audio, turns it into text, which is usually pretty messy. Run that text into ChatGPT, and it comes out with a very nice kind of streamlined summary of the discussion. So that's quite amazing, really. And then polishing, basically anytime you've got text that needs to be cleaned up, make it particular style, academic style, for example, it can do that, and it's shockingly good at that sort of thing. This is from a different website, and this is a website that basically claims to say how ChatGPT can be used in scientific research, and it talks about data analysis, literature review. I'll have some comments about that. Predictive modeling, I haven't ever tested. I'm not quite sure how that works. Text generation, well, that's pretty clear. Question answering, like I said, I use it all the time already. Experiment design, you can even pose the question, how would you design an experiment to measure X or to demonstrate X? And you may not agree with everything it tells you, but at least it gives you a starting point that's very good to work from in many cases. And it even is able to help with things like creating code to generate plots and so on from a data set. If you describe the data set in general terms, and maybe you say you want to use Python or something like that, it will give you code that literally will make a histogram or something with the labels and everything you want. It's crazy. So, my personal observations. ChatGPT is mind-blowingly good for surprisingly many things. It's that moment where you just realize that things have changed. And I'll mention that I've lived through a lot of technological revolutions in my lifetime. This is the first one where I recognized it was a revolution at the time it was happening. Every other one kind of snuck up and kind of, just things changed, but you didn't really perceive the change as it was happening. You look back retroactively. This is different. It's just shockingly new and novel in terms of what you're able to do and what you would have ever thought even really possible. So all of these things it seems to do really well. You can literally write code with it. I've written scripts in JavaScript, which I thought I was never going to be able to learn because it was too weird. And it works. It works. The caveat here is when you talk to it about specific questions or topics, it may give you very good information about certain things. It starts to have problems when you get into things that are not as well represented in the body of text that's on the internet, and I'll come back to that. All right, so here are things where it's not as reliable, sometimes very unreliable. And I have used it to try to do literature searches. And I'll show you an example of that in a minute, and sometimes it fails miserably in ways I'll describe. And I'll also give an example of what happens if you want to see a bio sketch of somebody. They may have an online presence, but what's it going to put in that bio sketch? I'll show you. And then I've had some things where, after getting very, excited about its ability to write code, which it does quite well in certain situations, I had a situation where it didn't understand all the nuances of pandas and keyword options for pandas functions and the difference between the different versions, that we were going in an infinite loop with every code that it gave me being wrong and generating bugs or generating errors, and it was not able to get out of that hole it dug itself in. And I also tried basically leading it through a physical derivation, something related to atmospheric thermodynamics, basic senior level stuff, right? hydrostatic relationship and so on. And it did okay at the beginning, and then it got itself into a hole, and it was like basically giving a world exam to a student that hadn't actually studied. So that happens. You have to be aware of these limitations. So back to what it is and what it isn't. It's not a repository of memorized facts. It's a language model that learns these probabilistic associations. If the linkage is strong enough in the training data, then specific facts will in fact emerge from the prompts. Otherwise, it's going to fall back on auto-generated text that mimics common language patterns. And you can't tell by looking at it which it is, right? So when it doesn't know something outright, it's the ultimate BS artist. I mean, honestly, it says stuff with confidence, but you can't necessarily trust it. I'll add that Microsoft's Bing, which I've not been able to use, apparently requires you to download the Edge browser to use it. So I have to use it, I won't use it. But it is different in that it takes ChatGPT and it couples it with a search engine, and so there should be more linkage between real information and... Is it still bad? Okay, well, I'm glad I haven't wasted time on it then. To give a specific example, I basically said, list 5 highly cited papers regarding long-term trends in oceanic precipitation. I was going to use that as an illustration for this presentation. And I expected to do very, very badly based on my past experience with it, okay? Turns out it actually did really well for this specific question. And the only problem with these is that there's a missing last author in that first citation. And I thought, wow, that's surprising because my previous experience had been far worse. And I asked it for the DOIs, and it gave me DOIs, and again, my expectation is that half of them would be non-existent or whatever. Turned out they were all correct except for one that pointed to a completely unrelated paper. For a slightly more obscure question I had asked a couple of weeks ago, every reference was non-existent. Every DOI was either non-existent or pointed to the wrong paper. So you have to be aware of the way it can go, and you have to verify everything. So in this specific case, it was pretty good overall, but commonly, cited articles and books may not exist at all, authorship may be incorrect, and DOIs may be either non-existent or point to an unrelated paper, and there's the old Russian proverb, trust but verify. This is another thing I thought I'd try as an example. Please provide a bio sketch for me. And essentially, everything that's correct, that's unambiguously correct is in green, and where it's notable, so it actually got my, University of Washington, and it's mentioned in my textbook, and everything in red is wrong. Just completely wrong. For example, numerous awards, AGU, all that stuff, completely wrong. So, I've never had, appointments at these other institutions either. So again, it's all merged together. And you can say, well, that's horrible. What is it good for then? Well, you can still take this raw output and you can quickly fix it up. It can serve as a template. And you can delete the bad stuff or correct the bad stuff, put stuff in that might have been omitted, and suddenly within like 5 or 10 minutes, you've actually got something that's valid. So in short, make lemonade if you get lemons. That's the end, I think. No, I just thought I'd mention in passing that we should forget, or not forget, that there's a lot of other AI tools that are not ChatGPT that have also come on the scene very recently that have more specialized purposes from text and design, video, productivity, business presentation, so on. I just cribbed that image off somebody's Facebook page, but I also did a little curation of some that were listed in a YouTube video called I Tried 200 AI Tools, These Are the Best. And that's probably already a month out of date, I don't know. These are not all completely relevant specifically to, in fact, most of them aren't very specifically relevant to us, but there are some interesting ideas, things you can use in tutorial materials, for example. You can generate videos, you can illustrate them. There's writing tools, there's creating whole presentation. Now, I'm not going to go through this, but there's the bottom link here is to kind of an up-to-date database of available AI tools. So even as this stuff is out of date, if you go to that link, you can search on specific applications and find tools that might be relevant to academic research, writing, teaching, whatever. That's all I had, and now Ankur is going to do the lead-in to my talk because
Right.
we just did
sorry about that.
It's
just
here.
a pretty packed day. Just got a PhD defense.
So we have a quick question from
Yeah, go
online
ahead,
here.
question, we'll switch slides here.
Matt Hitchman asks, how accurate is ChatGPT's algorithm for assessing whether it was used for a term paper? We have a paper that was flagged that way. What should we do about it?
I don't my depth. I don't know the
I'll
answer
tell
to
you a little
that.
bit. So, and thank you, Grant. Give Grant a hand. That was good. The question here Sure, and this relates to, the reason I kind of originally thought about this, giving this seminar, was also thinking particularly about its use in the classroom and its use by students, particularly in ways that might counteract our learning goals that we might want in a class, especially in writing assignments. And so this is a question from Matt about, there are now AI plagiarism detection tools. You can run papers through them, similar to the way you can run them through some of the other standard plagiarism detection tools like Turnitin. Turnitin, right, is just doing direct comparisons, and so you can find out exactly where were lifted text taken from without citation or attribution. The AI tools are opaque in that they're using some sort of probabilistic model to say how likely was this written by something that is similar to a ChatGPT bot, and they can be wrong. And so a lot of the discussion, I attended a workshop 2 weeks ago at the Center for Teaching, Learning, and Mentoring on AI tools in the classroom, and we actually did actual assignments that, both ones that were designed with AI in mind and ones that were not, and we saw how far we could get using the AI to do our homework for us. There are definitely signifiers of ways to detect. One is, as Grant pointed out, made-up references is a pretty common and easy one to figure out. We used a biology assignment where we asked it to find a high-impact paper about some topic and then summarize it for us, and it just completely made stuff up. It sounded good, right? It was a great bullshitter. So yeah, I don't know, this is gonna be an emerging thing, right? I don't think we can rely 100% on the plagiarism tools if you use them. I tend to rely a lot on trusting students and asking them, do they actually understand the material? I think if I were using that tool, I would have to, of course, have a meeting with the student and ask them to kind of convince me why this report is wrong. And I think you often, in a meeting, one-on-one with a student, you can quickly assess whether they actually know this material and actually did the research and actually wrote this, right? Because I view writing, the outcome of writing is really not necessarily the most important part, right? Writing is what we do as scholars to struggle through ideas to understand how something works, right? It's the struggle that's the important part of writing, not the fact that I produced a beautiful 5-paragraph essay. And that's something that is maybe thinking a little bit about how we might change assignments. Maybe some of the term paper type assignments we do aren't quite as effective, given that these tools exist, if we want to think about other ways. And this is something that I want to discuss. I don't have a lot of slides. I just want to point out here's a GPT for running a search engine. You can just use u.com that you can just write natural language queries and get results. I'm going to give a little bit of maybe the maybe less exciting perspective on the AI tools. I'm a little bit more sanguine that this is actually a big change or not. So for example, here's a DALL-E, an image generator. I asked it to give it an anime of a seminar being attacked by a generative AI. I don't really see the attack, but I'll take his art for what it's worth. You know, these AI language tools that can take human-produced input and produce human-like text or image or calculations, they actually already exist quite a bit in our everyday world, right? You can think translation tools basically are kind of based on the same kind of concepts. Search engine queries are starting to include some of those. Voice recognition, text message prediction, right? So predicting the next word on your text message. My kids live and die on Grammarly, right? That's all they use for helping edit their documents, right? Chatbots that we use frustratingly sometimes with phones. GitHub Copilot is a pretty common tool now for software development, which is a tool that gives you suggestions as you write code in GitHub. And then of course there's citation tools that are out there. So GPT-3, right, which was produced publicly, right, has some pretty remarkable capabilities because it's trained on a very, very large data set. Image generators, there's also been there was the fake Drake video and the fake Rihanna video that came out a few weeks ago, right? And now there's this whole question of how do you, if you use a celebrity name, image, likeness in an AI, how do you credit them, right? So lots have been written, there's tons and tons of articles about its impact on education. How do you develop AI-proof prompts? I don't think we have a good answer for that. How do we assess writing now, right? So some people have decided to go more toward in-class exercises, right? For example, is one option. But that might not be scalable, or that not be what you want in a, say, research paper. And then, as Matt just brought up, how do you detect plagiarism? GPT-4, which has now come out, is a cost model API that people can pay for. But a lot of those tools that Grant mentioned at u.com are basically licensing GPT-4 and then providing a service. this has led to an explosion of tools, right? And if you just go on Twitter, there's a whole bunch of Twitter tech bros who just constantly hype up every possible tool out there. I don't know who's using them. But I think in some level, is this revolutionary or not? Maybe a perspective. I kind of tend to think about how revolutionary the evolution of search engines in the late 1990s, when they went from useless and they never found anything you could find on the internet, you just had to memorize all sorts of web addresses and we had massive bookmark bars and all that, to Google, right? Which really changed how we thought about search. It actually worked because it used an algorithm that was based on network theory from two scientists at Stanford. I started using Google when it was cs.stanford.edu/Google, so I've been watching its evolution ever since. And it really, is this just the next evolution of search engines, right? And when search engines got good, it did change how we teach. It changed how we did library research. It changed how we found citations. It changed how we checked for plagiarism. And when I teach writing, we spend a lot of time talking about how do you sift through things that are verifiable versus not, right? If you type climate change in Google, you get a lot of very interesting articles, not all of which are necessarily very kind to our science. And that's something we have to think about, right? So we teach students how to do that because that's an important life skill that they always need. How do you tell what's hoax, what's real? Is this what we have to do with AI tools, right? Google and Bing are now catching up. What are implications, right? And I think you talked a little bit about GPT is. I won't kind of dive into this too much, but I do think it's worth thinking about the science because I think for our science, the actual concept behind transformer neural networks potentially has some really interesting implications for some of the kind of research you all do. And I don't know the details on this. This is something that's just, but I read a lot of articles on kind of what exactly large language models do. One thing to remember is they spent $7 billion building this, right? That's approximately the budget of the entire National Science Foundation, so it's not surprising that it could get something. Right? It's basically a neural network, so if you've done some AI stuff, you know neural networks basically take inputs, apply weights to it across multiple layers, and predict outputs, and then it affects those layers as a function of how good your outputs are to some training, right? This one has 175 billion weights, that's a lot, trained on billions of pages of public text. What it does is that given an initial set of text, that's what you ask it, this prompt, predict the probability of the next word or word fragment. That's all it's trying to do. Sometimes it's a syllable. There's 50,000 tokens in GPT-3 that it could predict as the next word or syllable. Most of the time, choose the most probable word that is likely to come next based on what you just already give it. And once in a while, don't. That's actually the magic of it. This is what actually makes it work. This is not that unlike a lot of Markov chain type data assimilation algorithms where you often don't, otherwise you get stuck in a local optimum. Right? Rerun the model, so now you just take your new result with your new word fragment and then guess the next word fragment. You just keep doing that until you reach an end token that says stop. So it's a feed-forward neural network. And so that's all it does. The way it works mathematically, and so Wolfram, the Mathematica author, has a really nice long article of what it's doing. Every word is converted to an embedding, or a number. Right? That number is based on the nearness or similarity of that word to other words in the training text, right? Which is not unlike what the translation engines did, right? They're comparing two texts. And then the magic here, in terms of what makes this better than the old ones, other than it's really big, is that it also keeps track of the position of the word in a sentence, that's what the transformer neural network is. It provides memory. So some of you might have used long-term, short-term memory neural networks. That's kind of a pretty popular one for doing time series predictions, where you use lagged weighting to predict the next number. We've been using it to predict groundwater levels and inspiration based on meteorology in our lab. So this is just the next level of this, where you actually have an entire set of embeddings that keeps the distance of the words from each other as part of the prediction. And that's why it's good at actually, your text messaging predicting app on your phone doesn't do that. And that's why it just kind of gets into garbage as soon as you keep pressing the next most common word very quickly. By keeping track of all the words behind it, it's really able to kind of figure out what is likely. And that kind of is the natural feature of language, right? A lot of the context of language is often at the beginning of the sentence, not the end of the sentence. I think it's a lot like autoregressive time series forecasting, and it's a cousin of predictive text messaging. And it's uncanny how well it works, as all the examples that Grant just showed you. But I think there's something in this, like, we should think deeply about how this might potentially influence the way we do research, or things that we could use in forecasting and projection and analysis of weather and climate hypotheses. I'd love to think about how we do that. That might actually be a much more fun and exciting use of this stuff than making it come up with BS biographies about people. There's no easy way to detect whether it's right. ChatGPT cannot search the webs, other of them can. And then GPT-4 is licensed, and the big difference is it has more weights and longer tokens, and it can go further back. So it can actually keep memory of a conversation. You can have a chat with GPT-4 back and forth. So in higher ed, there was even, UW News even covered this. There was ChatGPT was used in materials research for like a kind of building literature together. Outlines, it's really good at. Cleaning up paragraphs, transcriptions, as Grant mentioned, summarizing, debugging to the extent that the code is relatively generic. As you get more and more into specialized tool things, it gets further and further. In some ways, it's been trained on Stack Overflow, right? And so it's basically just a better search engine for Stack Overflow. It can role play scenarios, which is great. Make publication, it can imitate celebrities, etc., develop creative assignments, simplify routine tasks. My wife actually uses it for writing emails that she hates writing, and guess, the like very generic emails that you need to send sometimes to coworkers. Or this is one that I think is a popular assignment now. Have students use ChatGPT to write something, then write on your own and compare, right? What are the mistakes or errors in the AI assignment versus your own writing? Right, or kind of beat the AI. Can you write something that's actually more nuanced? Because it's really, really good at doing surface level writing, very, very poor at going deep or analysis or having opinion. To keep in mind as you think about assessment of writing in the classroom. There's also been assignments where people use the AI to create creative prompts based on ideas you've given. So you're using your ideas, but you're using the creativity of the tool to say, write this in a style as I did the other day in a Run DMC rap. Right, or whatever else you want. And then you can kind of take advantage of those features, right? There's a lot of pitfalls, and this broadly feels there's an entire subfield of research called AI ethics, right? So, right, it can undermine learning as we're thinking about this. It's hard to detect misconduct. Any bias that's in the training will lead to bias in the output. We've already seen this. You can you can jailbreak the AI, as it's called. You can give it certain prompts where it suddenly becomes racist, where it becomes sexist, where it decides that it wants to take over, as we did at the solstice party. I had the AI be evil, and it eventually said that all professors are going to be replaced by it, right? The New York Times had tried to marry it, right? How do you credit AI-generated work? You can give harmful messages, right? So if someone is using this for, say, mental health or emotional support, how do we know that it's using best practices? How do we know it doesn't actually cause more harm? OpenAI collects all of this data because it actually trains on the chats you're giving it. And so privacy issues if you're sharing information. For coding, it's a nice tool, but it's been now being shown as leading to a lot of really poor coding practices because you're not following house style, especially for software engineering. You're not following kind of practices that can detect security issues or leaks or things like that. That hardened coding is a big part of software engineering. It just gets you the quickest answer fast, right? And then there's Vanderbilt University had a thing where it used ChatGPT to create a letter for a Michigan State shooting, right? And it was, so even though the letter was maybe okay, just the sense that it was created by the AI led to outrage, right? That kind of makes sense, right? The message yesterday from LeVar Charleston about our vile racist things going on this campus was written by an AI, I'd be pissed too. There is now publication statements on whether AI can be a co-author. This is an interesting question you may have to think about. If you use AI in helping you generate your manuscript, do you credit it? How do you credit it? So there is now a publication ethics session. This is the Committee on Publication Ethics that I occasionally will do some work with. AI tools cannot meet the requirements for authorship according to COPE. As non-legal entities, they cannot assert presence or absence of conflict of interest. So their point is if you use AI tools in creating images, writing the manuscript, creating elements, analyzing data, you must disclose it in materials and methods. But you're fully responsible for the content as authors, even if parts are produced, and thus individuals are liable for breach of ethics. A cool future. I often think, like, here was the first ChatGPT good old Clintons, right, from Microsoft Word, you remember that era. It looks like you're trying to reconsider my legacy. I know. I think there's some interesting stuff in time series prediction we should think about how we can do that. There are some few folks here in SSCC and in the new data science school and elsewhere who are thinking about these deeply. Suggest new methods for solving a problem, right? So maybe you're like, how do I analyze this data set? What are good statistical significance tools I should use, right? Maybe, so you can license ChatGPT to train it on your own text. Maybe if we fed it all storm reports, right? Or if we fed it all AMS journals, right? Could we learn some new pattern about something that we haven't thought about before, right? As I mentioned, use it for writing coding calculation. So that was all I wanted to mention, because I just wanted to maximize the remaining half an hour we have for just what people are thinking about, things they've heard about. Maybe you've used it already successfully in something or whatever. So, yeah.
You're talking about the early search engines and kind
Yeah.
of their evolution.
Yeah.
Can you kind of compare and contrast that ChatGPT where it is now with when Wikipedia came out?
Oh, Wikipedia. Yeah, that's a good question. I tend to think about search engines a lot because it did make a big impact on how we found information, right? It changed completely how libraries worked, right? It changed how things in the classroom worked. I think in terms of where it was, obviously Google 1.0 or Wikipedia 1.0 certainly had a lot of holes, right? It was good at finding stuff, but obviously the web wasn't as big, right? I do think there's definitely a big difference in 4 versus 3 in ChatGPT just from having more weights. It is computationally very expensive right now to run, so they're spending millions of dollars a day to run this public instance. And there's a question of when they'll start actually charging more for it. So that's a little different than, say, some of these other tools, where Google is pretty expensive to run, but nowhere near, right? And so a very cheap ad-supported model tends to work pretty well, especially because they have a near monopoly position on that market. But I don't know what the cost model is, and that's going to be, I think, a question in terms of that. And will it change? Yeah, I think those stuff will get better. I think there's going to be some limits to how far you can, right? The human creative impulse, I don't think is in a transformer neural network. I'm not sure yet. I think there's pieces of it, right? It's really good at mimicking. I don't think it will ever create something completely novel. But that's my opinion. I could be wrong. Casey.
Thank you guys for this great video. And I was wondering both for Grant and for you, Ankur, yellow light applications in ChatGPT, because the wife is using it for reference letters.
Yeah. Yeah, it's true.
All of
Right.
everything. And it can be math.
Sure.
Do's and don'ts, hot takes.
Yeah. So I'll say, so what my spouse does, who's a high school teacher, is really for when, and she's the department chair. I know we have a terrible family of very bitter department chair people in our house. Her job is better than mine, by the way. Is really for helping finesse writing difficult emails well, particularly to coworkers, right? So as a chair and having to communicate, or particularly to get some point across to an administrator, right? To say, this is what I need to say in a way that isn't as snarky as if I was gonna write it myself because I'm pissed at this administrator. So I think in some ways that kind of helps, when you're trying to write something important where you need to get the question across without getting stuck in your own emotional framework of kind of that message, right? I think if you're using it I wouldn't use it to write a letter of reference, right, a recommendation. I think it'd be a step too far, as I feel like that's a personal endorsement that I'm giving. I haven't used it directly for much in terms of email writing. I don't know, Grant.
Not email, but so I use it for drafts where I might do kind of just a raw dump of stuff, where I might do my own version of something and then have ChatGPT clean it up. And I never use what it outputs verbatim. I find that I can't. It doesn't work, but I do use it to prompt edits and to improve the flow or something like that. And so for me, the appropriate boundary is not letting it auto-generate a letter or auto-generate anything, but essentially making an iterative process where it's serving like as a copy editor or, just a general editor to improve the wording or the phrasing of something or to shorten. So for example, I submitted a GRL paper a few days ago, and they got a really strict limit on length. And I had to get it down to 3,500 words, and I had 4,000 words. And I basically had to take paragraphs and say, ChatGPT, make this paragraph shorter if you can. And so it took the content and shortened it, and oh yeah, that works, and it deleted some things that maybe I might have preferred to leave it and put it back, but it was, again, I wasn't just giving it blanket license to change everything and that got submitted.
Right.
Rather, it became a tool for helping me condense or helping me quickly see ways to condense or improve the conciseness of the presentation.
Yeah.
Just to follow along with that, do you have to cite it with that, like just using it like that?
So journals are putting out different policies, and some of them require you now to put a statement as to whether you used AI for something, and if so, in what capacity. And of course, a lot of them are saying you can't be ChatGPT can't be a co-author. My personal feeling is that if you're using it as an editing tool, you might need to mention that, I use AI as an editing tool, but ultimately the words you submit need to be your words, and you need to sign off. Even if you're writing a letter or an email, you need to be, your name is on it, and you have to be responsible for the content of it, even if it's changed the wording a little bit. That seems to me to be kind of the crucial thing.
Okay.
Yeah, kind of, you think about like a continuum from anything, from abstract, initial abstraction, not like a journal abstract, but like an abstract idea,
Right.
through to finished product. If you think of it as a continuum, ChatGPT can live in the middle. You still have to insert yourself on either end of
Right.
that, in my opinion.
Yeah.
No matter what, from email to code, go ahead.
And I'll add that there's not really any fundamental qualitative distinction between ChatGPT helping with editing and having Grammarly help with editing, or having some other tool that basically looks for grammatical correctness. It's a continuum between those two extremes. There's no dividing line where suddenly,
Right.
it's a whole different world, and you're letting it basically substitute for human thought.
Yeah, tell.
So one of the things that I've seen discussed as danger issue, and I want to get your take on this, is worried that it's going to just basically so much garbage that it's going to make the internet unusable, basically. Because combined with some social media, it's really good at coming up with fake news, and especially outrageous fake news, and a asymmetric leaning towards outrage of so there's, as far as I've learned in the AI community, there's this worry that you'll just start, and we've already, you already see like lots and lots of AI stuff, deep fakes,
Yeah.
etc., coming up, and that effect that will.
So what will kill us in the end?
So that it will kill, yeah. I mean, and that's the
Yeah.
alignment issue, which is really interesting.
It's a great question about, to what extent do tools like this, especially this proliferation, and lead to essentially degeneration of our usability of things like the internet, because it is not verifiable, or it adds facts, right, to things that aren't real. It is something that we're seeing a lot of statements about, right? So there have been a few kind of, early researchers in the field who have been putting out statements about concern, putting out ChatGPT 3 in particular, the OpenAI version, has recently really locked down, and there's a lot of things it won't tell you about anymore, right? Some things to its detriment, right? Because historical topics that may have sensitive issues, like, so now if you ask it about, say, the Holocaust, it will actually say, as an open language model, I can't talk about that, right? Or something like that, which is unfortunate, right? Because there's history that you might want to learn, but because people can use it for nefarious reasons to get it to push it to say certain things, like, was it real, right? That you start getting into these questions about how do you put ethics into AI. This is why that field has become big, right? We have an AI center at University of Oklahoma that Amy McGovern runs on atmospheric science and climate, where her big focus is on the ethical use of AI in atmospheric sciences, in addition to developing the tools.
I think at the bottom of that, the one that is the incredible pervasive confusion our society has when they think about information and knowledge. They are not close to the same thing. Information, it has a valueless, it's a valueless parameter. Knowledge has value. And so when you have to stay away from commenting on the Holocaust, because you don't want to add information that has a bias. Instead of saying there's knowledge, it's a knowledgeable fact this occurred. That's to me, that's a sign of a really weak system of information. And the distinction between information and knowledge has to be more strongly. It's going to really take off the way people want it.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, right? And to some extent, like whether it takes off or not is less important than we do about it, right? Because it's gonna show up, right?
I think it's going to fall into internet today.
We're seeing like, so it's being used a lot of, right, I mean, because there's all these predictions about the number of kind of mid-range white-collar service jobs that it would overtake, like paralegals, right? But at the same time, right, so there are legal firms that are potentially using this to create decisions, create contracts, right? But you still need somebody looking at that stuff because it's still being signed off by lawyers who make and lose a lot of money in cases based on very small changes in interpretations of a single word, right? So, yeah.
Has the university provided guidance over to lecturers about the use of it and what are the penalties that regard the same as plagiarizing text for text from an article? And like, will students get, I don't know, expelled for using it too much?
So at least when at our session, we didn't quite talk about that in detail. You would follow the student academic misconduct for citing, essentially using work that's not your own, right? There's some gray area, right, to what extent if I'm using it to summarize, or if I'm using it to get around, right? Because you could say, take a text, right, and ask ChatGPT to summarize it, and now you have a new text that would pass maybe a standard plagiarism detector. Yeah, I mean, that should be misconduct, right? It's hard to detect. I think it's an open area. And the reality is that it's happening, right? It's happening, we all had students who, including possibly ourselves, who waited till the very, very last minute and will be desperate to use any tool out there to get their assignment done. And what we did in the breakout rooms at that session was, actually did that and came up with passable, you'll get a C on this level assignment. That's an interesting question. And at some level, we have to accept that it's going to be there. My take, as I'm thinking about teaching next semester, a writing intensive class, is to just be really open about it. I feel like I should teach students what this tool can or can't do, especially the stuff about making up references, about let's put in an author, let's put in a paper, and let's see what it comes up with, and being able to show through a few examples kind of that we need to teach, like after they graduate, it's likely these students are going to still use these tools, right? They're going to use it maybe to help them write their resume. They're going to use it maybe to write a cover letter for a job. They're going to use it for maybe some of their first things that they have to do in that job. They ought to know what they can do with that successfully and what things are going to get them in trouble. In the back, or after.
Yeah, I have kind of a long question because I have seen that there are companies which are not relying on other companies using AI. So if I'm getting a product for another person, they would ask me not to use AI for that. They have kind of a mistrust in the other person using AI. Do you think that more advances in AI is either gonna push the people to start using AI or just more robustly restrict themselves, like no more AI?
Question. I don't know the answer to that. I think that's the kind of thing we got to navigate. What's going to be permissible, what's not. We're still exploring a lot of that, and there are people who react to it. I think the people who refuse to use AI at all are going to get rolled over by the fact that everybody else is using it. They're going to be at a severe competitive disadvantage, for better or for worse. So that's a reality, I think. The question is how we survive that transition is the hard part. I did want to briefly come back to Hamish' question about the plagiarism, because early on, I asked the question of ChatGPT, what are the ethics of using verbatim text from ChatGPT in a publication, okay? And it actually gave a fairly nuanced response along the lines of, well, this is not, AI can't own copyright to something. It's not a human creator, it can't be responsible for the content. It's a tool for generating text. I'm summarizing. And so you're not plagiarizing somebody else, you're not violating copyright. ChatGPT, at least at the time, claimed you don't even need to cite it as a source. And so at least it was offering a very generous view where you use it as a tool to shape and generate material that you can use, but it's not imposing any kind of restrictions. But that's different if you have an assignment, for example, that specifically is requiring you to do independent thinking about something and not to use a tool like that. And that's where it gets into the academic ethics, right? But I think that simply using material generated by AI, if you write a book about something and you write a chapter with the help of AI, you have to be responsible to the author for the validity of that chapter, but you don't have to cite a source and say, this is from whatever. So it's a gray area, but I think the gray area becomes less gray if the goal is for people to be writing stuff independently without the help of that tool, and they do it anyway.
And I think the other aspect of what Rudy one of those privacy aspects brought up, it's also a security aspect. A company might not want people to use these sort of AI. You give it, however little you give it, goes somewhere and is stored almost certainly somewhere, and that Department of Defense, individual companies, their secrets leaked. Even in research, academic research, if you're in a very highly competitive field, essentially your hot topic research paper, and somehow somebody scoops you because of it, yes, maybe it's less likely, but it depends on where it is. A lot of these things, like Ankur was saying, you don't really, in the past, has gone somewhere where it's not so bad. Well, that might have changed a day ago.
Right.
Like these really high value aspects. Demo or educational activities is here.
Mm-hmm.
Not knowledge.
Right.
Monitoring for neighborhoods across the city. He said that ChatGPT had been essential for the functioning of their $0. And how else are you going to get somebody to write their own content, And of course he edits it. Summarizing your activities, and none of us do that, and the only time we do it and then you don't do it again for 10 years. And so, I don't know, I guess I'd just be curious about generation as opposed to these high level.
I think that's a good point, right? And so I just did this right now, right? What is and so U.com actually cites things, which is kind of nice, right? So what is our department known for? Kind of uses kind of how we think, climate, satellite, remote sensing, weather is coming from our website. And then it said, well, what are some research breakthroughs? And it's maybe not quite what I wanted, but in terms of being able to provide some of those types of lower level things, right? We all have a lot of requirements that we need. I would love the AI to make my current pendings and AI and bio sketches and annual activity reports. I tried to use it the other day because, we need to write a report to the department, to the deans about our analytics, our metrics, and I was trying to use it to help me pull out citation numbers to be able to parse, because everyone had written their bibliography in a slightly different format, and I wanted it to just turn that into a table, and it did okay.
I think it's funny to think about, you're talking about cover letters. It's interesting that the person writing the cover letter is using AI, and now companies you apply to are using AI. So I think we can use it as like a BS meter. Like, what can we get rid of? Like cover letters. If AI is reading it, a lot of this is just like, well, then we don't, what's the value add?
Yeah, that's right, we have this.
Also, my gut
Yeah, me too.
response to you is like, well, if this
Yeah.
is stuff that the ChatGPT can as much, right? Like maybe there's a lot of content created that.
There are definitely some Reddit threads where folks make two AIs talk to each other and they have fascinating conversations.
Yeah, so I had the same reaction, and I feel like when we talk about printed word culture that we have these days. So, back in the olden times when you had to set the printing press with like all the individual letters, people thought very carefully about what they wrote. They decided to print. And like, if it's so easy to just churn out this stuff that no one really reads, no
That's
one
the
really
point, right.
and just maybe it's time to sort of just rethink
Yep.
like
What it means to be human.
what we
Yeah,
need.
absolutely.
All the way to what it means to be
Yeah,
human.
Evan.
Yeah, maybe to take that a step farther, if you're using the very expensive to run, it's not just millions of dollars a day to run it, it's a lot of energy. So if you're using it mostly to churn out low-level bullshit and you're making our system work.
Yeah.
I agree. Does anybody know the carbon footprint of it? Does anybody-
Notice
Probably
this
still a little
is,
bit wide.
Sure, it's large.
Definitely,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
like.
Okay, so I'm gonna just take this ball. And there's so much. Scientists say, well, I don't have time for that. I'm not gonna be on social media. Bio, oh, my website's out of date, takes a lot of time to summarize. I feel like there's a huge public investment in literally something that can do it for you in a second with you editing. I think that actually, I think it removes.
Yeah, I mean, I saw one example of somebody who, this was not in academia, but somebody who was spending a lot of time having to write up invoices, say, for the work he did, right? And so what he did is he created an email integration where he would email just person, amount, and description, and then that would turn it into a nice email with a letter and an invoice with a pay to and everything else that, just takes time and doesn't really use your human capacity, it just uses your ability to put things in certain places on a page. Maybe there are ways we can be engaged more into things that matter. Being there in presence, right? And maybe that's the same for the classroom too, right? So maybe one of the arguments, there's a colleague who writes for Inside Higher Ed, John Warner. He's written a lot about ChatGPT. He kind of thinks it's a little bit overhyped, but part of his argument is that we should be rethinking how we do writing, right, in the classroom, right? There's no real point to the 5-paragraph essay other than it is a tool in high school that gets students to write. And then we spend a lot of time in college trying to break students out of that model, right? To be able to write authentically from themselves and not be afraid to have one-sentence paragraphs and to have I statements and quotes and things that really help their writing sound human, right? And sound engaging. That's the same thing, right? So maybe, the concept of a term paper is outdated, maybe, right? Maybe that we should rethink what it is we actually want students to do when we ask them to write a research paper. Should that prompt have some other directions to it? Because that's really what the learning is about. I don't know if that's right or not, but I'm just kind of throwing out that maybe some of these tools are making us think more creatively about what we do, say, in terms of education.
interested, like how this plays in the timing of COVID and so these two giant changes in education.
Sure.
The aspect of like, just a year ago, 2 years ago, we went from never having in-class exams, having home exams, written exams, term papers, and now does that change that model?
Yeah, does that change it? Possibly, right? Because if we put a lot of trust when we moved to primarily online learning and primarily take-home exams and all that kind of stuff on how students are doing. I'm a big believer in honor codes and using those liberally. A college that tests were not allowed to be proctored. But you got kicked out of college if you were even in the slightest faint of having been involved. And I think we should set our standards high and then build a model of trust, which is the human aspect, regardless of the tools that are around us that are influencing how students are using to learn.
Sorry to just double down, but like, how does that work in the continuum of like 300-person intro class to like 3-person seminar?
The short answer is that 300-person class is not an effective pedagogical model. It's just an efficient model for large universities to be able to teach lots of students. The question of how do we do that in the 300-person class is a good question. I don't know, right? At some level, I always accept that there are some students who are in college who are going to coast through and do the bare minimum, and they're going to cheat their way through, and I can't stop that, right? My goal is to set the standard for the students who want to be here and make sure that we're stamping out degrees for the vast majority of people that represent that, and that there's going to be some that will flake through. That's humanity, that's life. There's people who always take advantage of whatever system they're in, whether that's not paying their taxes or, doing the minimum to get whatever grade they need.
There's another angle to this whole thing that I think has not been commented on very much by people, and I maybe that'll change in the future. And it may be a little peripheral to what we do in the STEM field, where we're dealing with objective information, but I think it's going to touch very much on other aspects of intellectual endeavor, creative writing, art, photography, all these things, in the sense that so much of what we value in creative works, whether it's writing or imagery or music or what have you, we value because we believe it to have been a human creation, and that it has a human historical and cultural context, and that it's expressing a response to something. Whether it's trivial or not, doesn't matter. To what extent does art, photography, painting, creative writing, all these things become devalued and become meaningless if we come to suspect that this stuff is all being generated by machines? Again, that doesn't really work, it applies so much to our particular concerns in this building, but in the broader context of, creativity, intellectual pursuits. I think there's a really interesting question about how real art, verifiably human art, survives and maintains its value as we get flashier and flashier eye candy and ear candy kinds of auto-generated products from all the AI tools out there. It's not something I have an answer for, but it's something I've been thinking about a lot lately.
And I know we're past time, so I just wanted to share one resource. There's a few that we've included in the slides. So the Center for Teaching, Learning, and Mentoring, which is part of UW's Provost office, has actually an entire page on AI tools in the classroom and includes some resources for teaching and learning writing, some guides you can use for those of you, some of you who are TAs may find some of this stuff useful, and their viewpoint on academic integrity and some of the policies. So I definitely encourage those of you who are in the classroom to take a look at that page and see some of the resources. Thank you everyone for engaging.